Well, thank you. This is quite an unusual paper for me. I've done a lot of work with Herman on more contemporary stuff, but during the pandemic, I had this had a very short attention span and difficulty to hinder my impulses. So I thought maybe I could write a paper on economic history. And then when I thought maybe I can write a paper on economic history, I thought maybe I can write 4 papers on economic history. And 4 papers in economic history is, well, that's a thesis, right?
Yeah.
So I called up the economic history department and said, I can write a thesis in economic history. Will you let me? And they said, of course. So I'm a PhD student. I'm here today as a PhD student in economic history. It goes rather slowly since I have a normal day job, or actually 2 normal day jobs. But this is my first paper as a PhD student in economic history, and it came about during the pandemic. I had recently read a paper from Konstantin about St. Petersburg, where it was mostly influenced by the data gathering process, which now I think AI has sort of made it easier than it was for you when you gathered the data, and for me when I gathered this data. During the pandemic, I was scheduled to go to the US for a conference. This was 2 days before Donald Trump closed the country. I found myself with an empty calendar for 2 weeks, sitting in my living room, since that, well, you remember what you did during the pandemic, that was basically it, right? So I went to the historical records of newspapers, and then this paper came out of that. I'm going to skip through quite a few things, because I made this presentation, I just recall I made this presentation for a very much longer time slot. I don't want to uphold you for an hour or so. So I'll skip through a few things. Probably most of the introduction, actually. What I care about. We'll start with the Swedish Rental Act, so you get some sort of basic understanding of the system that we have today. I think Herman went through how it looks like today rather well. But we've had rent control for a number of years. Most people say that we've had it from 1942, which is true. We've had different types of rent controls since 1942. But we also did have it in 1917, like most other countries did. The First World War meant that resources moved from housing construction to, and all other sectors, for that matter, to defense. So politicians were wary that this will mean a heavy increase in rental prices. So they started regulating rents. Sweden was actually rather late in this process in 1917. Most other countries in Europe had regulated rents already in 1917. And we were also pretty lax on the regulation that we implemented in 1917. It was not a cap on rents as the one that we got in 1942, but rather a cap on rent increases. They were simply not allowed to be that large. What I find interesting with this period is that, and for all countries this is true, rent controls were virtually imposed in a political vacuum of rent controls. No one really had any experience of rent control in modern history when it was introduced in 1917. You didn't really know what to expect in terms of how will this impact construction. As we know today, it impacts it negatively. How will it impact rental conversions from rental apartments to owner-occupied apartments? They had no idea, so there were no legislation about that. When we got rent control again in 1942, they knew that rent control will impact rental conversions. So we also had a price cap on owner-occupied apartments from 1942 to prevent rental conversions. And one thing that they did not know was, let me skip a few slides. One thing that I'm particularly interested with in this paper that they did not know is, will a black market for rental agreements occur or not? And this is something that has interested me for a long time. I bought a rental apartment on the black market in 1989, I think, in central Stockholm. It was rather expensive then, as it would be now. She unfortunately traded it for some other apartment or a house, actually, a number of years later, which she sold, which is unfortunate for me since my inheritance will become lower. Too bad. And I wrote the book in 2009 about Swedish rent control, where I included a chapter on the black market. And when I started writing the book, I had this idea as a quantitatively driven economist that I wanted to observe a lot of prices and try to explain how does the black market work. Turns out it's very difficult to observe prices in the black market for obvious reasons. They risk going to jail if they are caught. So they're not happy with reporting prices to the Central Statistical Authorities, for example. So that was very difficult. I found a broker and had a conversation with him to try to get a few price points. But then I read Konstantin's paper, and I thought, well, maybe I can do something interesting about the rent regulation in 1917. So I started looking into data, and this is the drawing on the large literature of which now I think has expanded quite rapidly with the use of AI, because now it's so easy to digitalize old newspapers and scrape any ads for any prices. So that's easy. I started looking through Svenska Dagbladet, which is one of our largest newspapers back then in 1915, which is the first year I surveyed. They had this one page in the back of rental apartments every day for all days a year. So I went through all of 1915, quite a lot of ads for rental apartments. That's 2 years before rent control. I did 1920, which is smack in the middle of rent control. And I did 1925, which is 2 years after we abolished our first short period of rent control. And I noticed something interesting when I went through the data, which, well, first, it wasn't really too interesting. I kind of expected it, that it wouldn't be that many advertisements for rental apartments during rent control, because that's typically what you expect. Vacancies drop to virtually zero. And I think I have a slide on that. We'll get to, I can show I don't have a slide on that. These are how ads look. So this is just a rental apartment in 1915, a 4-bedroom apartment on an attractive address in central Stockholm. It cost 1,250 kronor per year to rent. In 1915, there were ads like this in abundance. In 1920, though, there are a lot of other types of ads, very few ads of apartments for rent, but a lot of apartments where, like this one, this is an elegant 9-room apartment in central Stockholm with all the modern accommodations that you could want, with furniture that you can get from the current tenant if you buy the furniture for, it says 40,000 kronor, which would be the equivalent today of 75,000 euros, I think. So that's very fancy furniture, or it's actually a black market transaction. And in 1920, there's a lot of these ads compared to other years. So I went through 3 years, 1915, 1920, 1925, digitalized all ads that I could find for those 3 years, which turns out to not be that many, but quite a few. In total, about 2,000 apartments that are listed. I have another material that I haven't digitalized yet, which I think will contain something around 100,000 apartments that I found when I did this work. But then AI didn't exist in the way it does now. So I'll get to that maybe for a coming presentation next year or in 2 years when I'm finished with that. So in 1915, there are roughly 600 apartment listings. 1920, fewer, 200 apartment listings, as you would expect. It's a period of rent control, and vacancies are virtually zero. 1925, after rent control, quite a lot of apartment listings again. We'll skip through these things. So I'm going to focus, I think, on side payments to skip a few other results. We can talk a little bit about furnished apartments as well, because furnished apartments, when we introduced rent control in 1917, were exempt from rent control. So if you rented out a room with a bed, rent control does not apply. You can take whatever rent you want. And the key thing I'm interested in here is, how does rent control redistribute value from, well, in this case, or in most cases, would be from property owners who, in a market without rent control, can take out whatever rent they want and extort the value from the apartment, to a setting where you have rent control, where you've given the current tenant the possibility to extract that value in a number of different ways. So furnished apartments is one way, if that's exempt. There is a book, it's a Swedish book in 1964, I think it was published by a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics, where he, in a part of the book, he goes through a number of apartments on the most fashionable address in Stockholm, it's called Östermalm, looking at the people who live there. Since we introduced rent control in 1942, when we introduced it in 1942, the typical family living in these apartments were husband and wife and, say, 3 or 4 kids. But when you reach 1964, what has happened is that most of these kids have moved away from home, and a lot of times the husband has passed away. So now there's a widow living alone in these apartments, typically very spacious 300 square meter, 9-room apartments. And he goes through, surveys these apartments, or a subsample of them, showing that these widows living alone in their large apartments can now rent out furnished rooms for a total sum of a rental income that widely exceeds the rent that they themselves pay for the whole apartment. Under the rent control, which is an enormous redistribution of value from landlords to arbitrarily current tenants who happen to get these fancy and nice apartments. Side payments is another way of capitalizing on that redistribution of value. So I think I have a number of different approaches, and I think that I only present one in this presentation of specifications, which is, it's just a normal simple hedonic regression explaining rent with a number of characteristics, among them if the apartment is furnished and if there is any side payment demanded on the side. And these are the results year by year. In 1915, what we'll be interested in looking, there is no, in 1915, there are no side payments at all. But if you rent out a furnished apartment, you'll have a rather hefty price premium, which is to be expected on any rental market. If you offer an additional service, then you will get paid for that additional service. But in 1920, the year of rent control, that extra fee for furnished apartments is more than twice as high. So this is evidence of current tenants being able to capitalize on rent control by charging a lot higher rents for people that they sublet rooms to. And in 1925, that possibility is gone because there is no more rent control to capitalize on. Next thing, and the thing that I'm mostly interested with in the paper is the side payments. If you charge a side payment, you can only charge a side payment if you're selling something that has a value, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you can't really charge a side payment, or otherwise no one would be willing to pay a side payment. This turns out to be, I think, a 40% discount on rents, something like that, if you translate it, which is rather hefty. So tenants living in apartments where they can charge side payments to move out have a very, 5 minutes now, great, thanks, have a very hefty rent discount. And And one thing I'm interested in with this, let's see if I'll have this page. One thing that I think is very interesting, particularly with the current debate on, and we've touched upon it a few times today as well, is expectations of future legislation. What will happen with this legislation? So here in Spain, are people willing to invest in new construction, although they abolished the rent control in Catalonia?
It's reinforced now.
And now it's reinforced
Again.
when they abolished it, a lot of people would think that, well, maybe they'll reinforce it again, so we're not going to make any huge investments now. And I think it sort of sometimes puzzles me in Sweden, because there is a hefty debate about rent control. There's been a hefty debate about rent control for the past 10 years at least, a lot shorter than we've had rent control, but the problems have sort of accumulated over time with the sharp increases in waiting times, for example, to name one, which is one of the most obvious ones, is people pay hefty amounts for rental contracts. The worst I've seen is somewhere around 300,000 euros for a rental contract, which you, of course, can sell at quite high transaction costs at today's market. But if we abolish rent control, that 300,000 euro investment will be made worthless overnight. Yeah. So there's a risk you're taking. But I'm interested in, what do people believe about rent control in 1920? And the way to get at that, people's expectations, is to see how does this investment correspond to other capital investments, using the same method that Herman presented just a few minutes ago. I simply simulate what's the capital cost that would be motivated for tenants to be equivalent between buying their own apartment or renting an at market rent level apartment, to buying an apartment under rent control for a side payment. Simply estimating this function with different assumptions of capital costs. And we see that where it occurs that renters would be equivalent between buying on the free market or buying on the black market, is that capital costs around 6 to 7%, which, if you turn to Rodney Edvinsson, who's a professor of economic history in Stockholm, who has studied capital costs during the same period, translates to equivalently the same. Capital costs at the same period were around 7 or 8%, telling us that people in 1920, when they bought their rental apartments, kind of expected rent control to last forever, not just for 3 years. And I think, so I have a number of slides, but I think we'll just end here, because I'm probably out of time. This says 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago.
1 minute.
1 minute, perfect. So I wanted to study the value redistribution that rent control has. I also wanted to write a paper in economic history, which I mean, that was the largest driving force in this. What we see in 1920 is that current renters are the ones who capitalize. Non-renters who want to become renters, they find it, they're going to find a more difficult situation. First, there are no apartments available to move into. Second, if they want to find an apartment to move into, they'll probably have to pay side payments, which then translates to the same as paying going market rents. Or they can rent now very much more than before, expensive furnished apartments or rooms. So rent control in this setting seems to benefit current renters at the expense of both landlords and people who would like to be renters, which I think is what we typically find in most other studies. So I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you.